Remember, global cues have also been relatively muted, especially on Wall Street, ahead of the Federal Reserve's meeting that's lined up next week. Well, across Asia as well, you're seeing a quiet session. Most of your Asian markets are trading flat to slightly negative. The U.S. markets gave very little in form of impetus for traders ahead of next week's Federal Reserve meeting. Well, apart from that, in terms of other cues that we've got, the U.S. stocks ended mixed, so the Dow actually gained in trade overnight. The Nasdaq and the S&P 500 ended the day on a fairly flat note. The 10-year Treasury yield is steady after briefly sinking to levels of below 2.80 as traders look forward to the next week's big meeting lined up. Well, apart from that, European stocks gained for the second straight day yesterday as insurance firms offset losses across the oil and gas companies. Across Asia, like I said, it's a mixed trade with a clear bias on the sort of cautious kind of note that we are seeing picking up in early trade. Well, you've got revised Japanese industrial production data that's expected later on today. EU 27 government officials are expected to discuss European Union's Brexit position. So that's the other big meeting that's lined up in the Eurozone. In terms of commodities, steel trades lower, aluminium trades marginally higher, zinc is trading higher, copper snapped a two-day winning streak to decline about 1%, and rubber actually trades lower, down about 0.5% in trade this morning. Crude is trading flat to slightly positive, and gold trades steady after declining about 0.7% in overnight trade. Well, we have with us Peter McGuire now joining in to take us through what he's making of all that global action. Peter, first up, you've got that big meeting lined up next week of the Federal Reserve. The dollar has actually gained the most in over 2 weeks. Firstly, on comments coming in from the White House, and more importantly, ahead of what's expected from the Federal Reserve next week. In terms of the dollar, what are your bets? How would you approach the dollar index? Is it a time to go long?
Well, good morning, Samina. That's a very good question. I think with that announcement coming through in the last 24 to 36 hours regarding Larry Kudlow and talking dollar up, I wouldn't be surprised to see a little bit more momentum to the upside. Weakness, as he mentioned, as far as gold. So there seems to be a little bit of horsepower moving up. I think the US dollar in some ways was probably a little bit oversold. It's back at about 90.5, that dollar index. So I think it'll be an interesting week next week. This week it's been a little bit choppy. If you're looking, no particular directional plays for many of the different markets. They've been a little bit sideways, but next week we could see a stronger dollar. So that'll be fascinating how that plays out.
And Peter, apart from the Federal Reserve, of course, the big story this week has been Trump and his talk on trade war. I do remember a couple of months ago, the focus very clearly was on tax cuts. And now, of course, he's turned a new page and he's talking about trade wars, sort of taking the attention away from those tax cuts that, global markets or corporates in the U.S. are watching out for. Do you think all of this is just talk, which may not potentially be followed by action, which may actually be good for the rest of the world? Or do you think this time around there's some sort of, sort of meat in what he's saying?
Well, when you're thinking about it, the tariff 25% on steel imports, 10% on aluminium. That's what he's. That seems to be very much the focus. I feel that considering he's a year and a bit into the term, he needs to move quickly on these. These were very much promises that, as far as his electioneering and his campaign, was very much about taxes, company taxes, and of course tariffs. And again, Kudlow there. It's going to be fascinating how China plays into that. I noticed the issues affecting India as well. So I think it's a wait and see, but I feel as though that he's very focused on this sort of intent, and the rest of March and certainly April are going to be interesting if they come into play and what impact it has to all forms of global markets, because it can be retaliatory, and what of course happens out of Europe and other markets and other first world markets are going to probably play ball with him and maybe increase their tariffs.
Right. Peter, well, along with all of that cues from the U.S., how are you approaching commodities? Are you still constructive on base metals right now, or would it be time to sort of, book your profits if you were sitting long, and maybe even consider initiating shorting some of these base metals that have ran up substantially in the last few months, if not years?
Well, that's right. I mean, they've had a nice rally, and there's no doubting that. And possibly if you see a stronger US dollar for the short to medium, it could be a time to book profits. Keep an eye on copper, of course, where gold trades. If it trades sub 1,300 and maybe, that 1270 number, then that could be a little bit of resistance there. But it just depends on what the situation is as far as Kudlow and where the president sees dollar. It was very, very heavily sold. And when you put your mind back, 103 towards that inauguration, January last year, we're now 14 months in, and he's seen it down at 88 and back at 90. So it's been volatile, and I think that possibly not a bad time to book some profits and take the chips off the table and just see what happens with dollar.
Lastly, Peter, what's the call on the dollar-rupee pair? We talked about the dollar, but how do you feel about the dollar-rupee pair in particular? The rupee expected to weaken further, you think, in the next couple of weeks or months?
Well, you could say, but it's very range bound. I mean, it doesn't seem to have a large degree of volatility compared to other currencies like yen, Swissy, or, of course, euro, and the Aussie. But I feel as though it'll probably stay at these sort of levels. You might see a little bit further softness if you see that dollar, march up from here and it hits that $92 index. And, of course, what happens with the Fed in the next, matter of weeks. So fundamentally, I think it's a lead up to Easter. It's going to be a big holiday period, this time next weekend. So, 2 weekends time. So, there could see some movement between now and then, Selena, and it could be a strong dollar over the next fortnight.